Scherkus.
Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Andrew Scherkus. I work at a Google Seattle office, and it is like 4 o'clock, and we're going to dive into the world of virtual reality. It's very exciting. I've been kind of working on this intersection of virtual reality and multimedia for the last 2 years. But first, like a little bit of background, what I was doing before that. I spent many, many years working on Chrome, building a lot of their HTML5 audio and video stuff. So I am personally apologizing for any pain and suffering that I've heard today. Developing and standardizing web tech is really hard work. And I just remember, actually many folks were here, I think, when we initially pitched the idea of media source at an open video conference in 2011, I think people thought we were really crazy. The idea that we'll use JavaScript to do media buffering and that everyone would ditch Flash in favor for this new wacky system with mysterious error codes would be wonderful. Anyways, it sounds like it's mostly working, so I'm happy, I hope. But the jury's still out whether I'm crazy or not, because I'm up here again working on virtual reality and trying to pitch a bunch of standards for a bunch of things that I think are nifty. So let's start. What do I mean when I say VR media technologies? And for me, it's sort of the set of audio and video technologies that enable immersive virtual reality experiences. So whether it's recreating the sense of sort of being at a concert or just being a tourist and being able to visit and experience places around the world. So again, we're defining it as sort of, that set of audio and video technologies that enable immersive, that's the key word, it's very popular, virtual reality experiences. And we kind of looked at this a lot, and we prototyped a lot of things. We saw what was out there. We looked at existing standards. We cobbled together a whole bunch of systems. And sort of what we arrived at as is high resolution and frame rate, 360, 3D video with high order ambisonic audio. I'm not really expecting anyone to know what sort of most of the stuff is or how you would do it. That's why I'm here. But we found that this hits a real good sweet spot for sort of creating that immersion. And it's kind of feasible with today's technology. And it actually kind of works from capture through post-production and editing and playback. So this is what I mean when I say VR media technologies. And the reason why I said that is also because I couldn't come up with like a nifty acronym. If you can think of a better way of calling this combination of technology, just let me know. But it wouldn't be any talk about multimedia technology without also talking about multimedia standards and the total lack thereof. This is a new space, and I'm really excited about it. We really want to see it to be successful. There's a whole ecosystem out there from camera manufacturers to people trying to produce and work with the footage to uploading it to distribution platforms. And we need tooling, we need interoperability, we need an ecosystem, and that means we need standards. So VR is kind of neat and fun. I'm kind of like sitting back here working on like standards and MP4 container spec stuff. So let's go back to that definition, right? High resolution, frame rate, 360, blah, blah, blah. Let's pick this apart bit by bit and kind of dive into what actually each one sort of represents. So we'll start with resolution and frame rate. And the sort of key thing here is that a lot of the requirements for the resolution and the frame rate is really driven by the sort of display you're using for your head-mounted viewer thing. And so with today's mobile phones, right, you can sort of expect on average around like a 1440p display. It's typically running at 60 hertz. It's 100 degrees field of view makes the math easy, and it's kind of in the right ballpark for a lot of these different headsets. And you've got 2 eyes. So if you combine all this together and you assume you're doing 360 video, 3D video, you can do a little bit of back of the envelope math and arrive at sort of a lower bound on what you would need to sort of fully saturate and leverage that display and optics you have, right? So that we're not so that we have enough pixels so that everything is as crisp as it could possibly be. And so we sort of arrive at 4,600 by 2,300 per eye. And of course, this kind of works out to about 2.5 times 2160p or 4K resolution. So it's a fair amount of pixels. And we want this at 60 frames per second because why not, right? Display's running at 60. We might as well have our video shot and played back at 60. So again, let's do some more math. And this puts us at sort of like the 1.2 billion pixels per second range, which, okay, it's fine. So I promised we'd talk about standards today. And so let's see what we have, right? So here's some popular codecs out there. And we'll notice right away that us VR folk, we're way out in 6.1 land. I actually did not know we went beyond 5.2. I've been working in H.264 for so long. And yeah, we're kind of slotted in this 2 billion pixels per second range. For reference, 4K and sort of what a lot of the industry is working with today is in the 5.1, right? That's your sort of 4K at 30 range. So we are way the heck out of there. It's been kind of fun and challenging dealing with this type of content. You also may notice that H.264 doesn't really define levels beyond 5.2. And this actually does kind of present a real problem. Another sort of team we have up in Seattle actually built this jump camera rig. And it's like the GoPro rig. It captures full 360 seamless video. And it outputs, 2 billion pixels per second, right? So it does 60 frames per second at about 5,700 by 2,800 stereo. And when we're sort of building this, it came to a certain decision where it's okay, how are we going to encode the video that this thing outputs? And so the sort of lack of standards was a little bit of an issue, right? We could have gone with sort of VP9 and HEVC. But then if you were to take that and then hand it over to someone who does a lot of post-production, that industry does not work with these codecs yet, right? They haven't quite caught up. And so all of their tools just kind of barf at this content. So we're okay, so then we'll just maybe encode technically illegal H.264, right? We're just cramming 2 billion pixels into a 264-bit stream. And we'll give that to the post-production crews. And it kind of works, but you still kind of find different tools will kind of barf on it and say, there's no way you can have that many pixels. I cap out at 5.2. I'm not playing this file. So it's a bit of an issue, but level 6.1 content is more or less here. It's actually kind of funny if you go on the VP9 site, they have a couple TBDs in level 6.1 and 6.2. But it's kind of fun because the content's here today, even though I'm sure we were waiting for broadcast televisions and NAB a couple years down the road to actually have broadcast television doing 6.1. We're kind of dealing with it right now. So I don't really know what the right step is here, right? You can either wait for the whole ecosystem to catch up to VP9 and HEVC for doing content production, or maybe the ITU should specify more levels for 264 to make this transition easier. I don't really know. I don't have a good answer there. ProRes and sort of those intermediate codecs like DX and HR, they work great, but they're not good for delivering files between. Yeah.
But you're saying that delivering between editors and stuff is a problem? Or?
It can be, yeah.
Well, that industry does it every day. They just use Spherical.
I'll take that offline. So that sort of packs up the high resolution, high frame rate part. And so the next real piece, right, is 360 video. And really, the key thing about doing any sort of 360 video is that it all just boils down to picking a sphere to plane projection. And what this really means is, video technology is all 2D based, it's all rectangular based. We have a sphere, you need to somehow represent that sphere on a plane. And there's really just kind of boil it down, there's 2 options that you should really just kind of consider when you're dealing with most of this stuff. The most popular one, Equirectangular, it looks like a map. It's got some good things going for it. It's got some terrible things going for it. And here's what a still frame of video would sort of look like. You can kind of make out what's going on. And if you were to hand this to someone who's never really worked with 360 video, they can figure it out, right? And we've actually done this, right? Lots of people can figure out how to sort of edit this footage. And it has this nice property where you can shimmy the content horizontally if you wanted to sort of line up shots in a certain way. It's okay. The biggest downside is that it oversamples like crazy at the poles, right? Like my fingers at the bottom just kind of stretch out, and even though my fingers are all relatively the same size, they take up a lot of space. So it's just kind of not really efficient. So we just like to kind of coin it as saying, you know what, Equirectangular, good for humans, right? You can kind of figure it out. The other real popular contender is cube maps. These have been around for years. They've been in the gaming industry a lot. They have native support on graphics cards. And it's also got some good properties and some bad properties. So if we were to take that previous frame and we run it through some software that can reproject it to a cube map, we get something like this. You can see there's already a lot of black space, and that top and bottom section are now much more representative. And of course, right, let's just rearrange this to save some space. And we get us into what we like to call a baseball layout, right? If you imagine a baseball and you undid the stitching, and you kind of unwrapped it and folded it around, you have a cube map baseball layout. It's fantastic. So yeah, cube maps, good for computers. It's sort of a no-brainer improvement, right? If you're dealing with streaming this kind of content and you don't want to have humans look at it anymore, so you're done with editing, you can just pretty much convert it to cube maps and kind of go from there. But what if you had something kind of like this, right? This is a kind of raw footage from a handheld 360 camera. And it's not really, it's kind of, it's sort of two hemispheres, and it's two fisheye lenses, and they're rotated on their side. And if we were to try to define something like this and create a standard around this, it'd be very intrinsic to the camera and the lens properties and the lenses. And it'd be really hard to sort of enumerate every single detail about this. So the sort of one idea that we have that we'd love to get some feedback on is we sort of just treat this as a texture like you'd find in a video game and say, wouldn't it be great if you could define a sort of 3D geometry and a texture coordinate mapping? So that if you did have one of these funky cases and you wanted an easy way to easily preview this file, for example, you could just define a mesh, and that'll provide the projection information to the client if they wanted it to render it properly. So we kind of view this as the catch-all case, right? You've got your Equirectangular, you've got your cube maps, and then you kind of just have an arbitrary whatever you want. So yeah, we like to say mesh, good for whatever you want. It's a catch-all, right? So are there standards for any of this stuff, right? Because again, that's really sort of what I'm working on here. And of course not, right? We were just looking at this stuff a year or two ago, and meshes were something that I think we landed in our GitHub this week or last week based on some internal stuff we've been working on. And so, as I mentioned, it's we have this GitHub. We sort of do define our specs here. And we really find that putting the projection information in the container itself is really sort of a key concept that we're big fans of. You can kind of think of it as this projection is similar to initialization codec data, right? You sort of need this information to properly really interpret and play back the video. And if you're wondering why it's V2, we have defined a V1. It is a blob of XML that's in a container, and I think it's just a very bad idea, and we should not focus on that. We should just move on to V2. But it looks like this, right? Here's your standard sort of MP4 box structure layout. And yeah, we define this new box, SV3D, which is a spherical video box. And it's got pretty much information in there on what the projection is, if you want to sort of maybe define a rotation, so maybe you want to have the orientation adjusted for your sphere so you don't have to totally reproject the video. And we have a couple boxes defined, right? And you can probably guess what these are, where you have a a projection box declaring equirectangular, a box defining cube map, and then sort of your catch-all box defining mesh. So yes, there is a bit of 3D geometry encoded inside that MSHP box. So that's sort of what we have kind of on our minds for 360 video and sort of the standardization around that space. And now we kind of move on to 3D video. So 3D video has been around before. 3D TVs were all the rage for a while, and there's been a lot of work in this space. So we sort of had a bit of a head start here. So standards, yeah, sort of. Some codecs do define ways of doing stereo video. But one thing that we noticed right off the bat was we really wanted a codec agnostic way of defining this information. So that, right, if we did use ProRes in an MOV file, you don't actually have to define like the special ProRes way of doing stereo video. And so we have another box, SD3D, and we just figured we'll stick it right beside the other one and have this field called stereo mode. And this is like probably the simplest part of this whole talk. We've got 3 options, 0, 1, and 2. And so for 0, we have mono. For 1, we have top, bottom. And does anyone want to like vouch or guess as to what 2 is? Yeah, it's left, right, right. That's all there is to it. Why not right, left?
Why left, right, as opposed to just doing 1 to 0? Like hardware decoders prefer 1.
I can give you examples. Yeah. So that's the basic sort of 3D video aspect, right? We tried to keep it simple there. Which brings us to this last bit, which is real fun, higher order ambisonic audio. This one is way out there, right? So I kind of brought you to the like simple 3D part, but now we're going to go like deep into space. And it's this thing called like, ambisonics. What are they? Disclaimer, I am like not a master expert pro ambisonic person. This stuff is pretty complicated, and I know it's pretty late. But I'm going to simplify it the best way I can. So, ambisonics, the key concept to think about is that it's a full sphere representation of audio. And that when you have a full sphere of audio, sort of imagine like we're able to fully capture all of this audio in this room right now, that at runtime, depending on where I'm looking, you can sort of like render it down into like a perfect little like stereo mix for your ears. So it's like it responds to where you're looking. And this means that we can create a much more immersive audio experience, right? That's our goal. So to contrast this with surround sound, right? Surround sound, like everything is fixed, right? If you had 4 channels of audio, usually applies, means you have like quadraphonic layout, and you've got like 2 in the front and 2 in the back. And it also means that like a lot of the surround sound tech, it's very codec dependent. Some of the solutions out there are proprietary and may involve licensing fees. And a nice thing about ambisonics is that, again, they are sort of codec agnostic. And they work by something pretty funky called spherical harmonics. And if you go to the Wikipedia page, which I totally suggest you do if you want to sort of have your eyes glaze over, it is filled with equations and equations and equations, none of which I understand, and this really cool GIF that really represents spherical harmonics in various frequency domains or something like that. But again, I can spend a whole talk on this, and I'm not going to. The reason why I bring up spherical harmonics is because that is what each ambisonic audio channel is, essentially, and that they are infinitely extensible. And that what this means is that with ambisonics, you can increase the resolution and fidelity of that like sphere of audio as you just kind of crank up the number of channels. And so like the rough analogy to like the 360 video space would be imagining that we're just going from like SD to HD to like 4K resolutions, right? That's sort of what ambisonics provides, which is you can just kind of keep cranking up the number of channels, and you kind of get more and more and more fidelity and localization and spatialization. And it kind of follows, again, similar to video dimensions, it follows a geometric increase in channel numbers. And so for your 0th order, which is just basically mono audio, you have 1, and then first order, 4 channels, 9 channels, 16 channels. And it's at that 2nd and 3rd order of ambisonics where we have sort of 9 and 16 channels. That's what we refer to as higher order ambisonics. You have enough sort of fidelity in that sphere of audio that sort of creates for a really good experience. And as you may be catching on, there are like no standards for this stuff. We tried. I think there is, I think if you dig through MPEG enough, you'll find a representation for any kind of audio scheme. But in terms of just representing ambisonics as is, there was nothing that we could find. So again, it came to sort of defining yet another MP4 box. We call this one SA3D, and it talks about the type of ambisonics, the order, how many channels, channel mapping. And again, similar to that 3D specification, it's codec agnostic, right? So if your codec supports 16 channels of audio, technically you can make it work with ambisonics, which is nice. So if you want to use PCM, you can do that. Or as some other folks at Google are working on, if you want to use Opus, you could totally do that, right? So here's someone at Google who is working on an IETF spec for figuring out how to combine ambisonics into an OGG and Opus combination. So there we have it. We got through the scary ambisonic audio part, but TLDR, sphere of audio, crank up the channels, you can create great audio experiences by looking around. It's kind of the basics. And there you have it, right? Like that is essentially, I've walked you through what we like to call VR media technologies. You slap them all together, and you get something that's actually pretty immersive and pretty cool. And we've also covered all the standards, or the complete sort of lack thereof. But here's sort of like my pitch now, where it's pretty lonely out here. I feel like sometimes like we're in space trying to figure out all this stuff. And we would actually love like an extra set of eyes, or just some extra things we may have overlooked. Help us define what these standards are. Everything we do is on our GitHub. We have a public group where we've had like folks from different companies chime in. Like for example, we've actually tried to define a lot of other container equivalents. So we've defined a couple equivalents for WebM. I think our spatial audio one doesn't have a WebM equivalent yet. So that's a great thing that someone can help us figure out. And my last pitch too is if you can think of a better way to call all this stuff, I'm all ears. So thanks. Yeah.
Two questions. One, a small one, like when you define projection, is it supposed to be static metadata, or you envision it to be like a stream, like it may change over time during the video playback?
I think we mostly view it as static, but associated with sort of the like initialization sort of sequence parameters, right? So you could imagine that similar to adaptive bit rate, where you would you would have new initialization data at different sort of resolutions. You could have an opportunity there to let's say, okay, I'm going to change the projection. Right, or if you wanted to, for whatever reason, swap between Cube and Equirect on the fly. That's sort of the mental model we have.
And one question. So we spent many hours discussing 1080p, and then we just blew up the whole reference was megapixels. How far ahead, like how many years we should, from your experience, will pass till we get to these numbers? And what is your plan before that? Because Daydream is coming, what are you going to present us? The flat pictures?
So it's different depending on which stage of the pipeline you're talking about. We sort of surprised ourselves on the capture front, where we're like, we built this camera and we're like, holy crap, that's the resolution outputs. That's crazy. And then when we like bring it into like, post-production and editing, depending on sort of the software suite you use, there's something that's popular called like a proxy workflow. So you work with really low resolution content, and then when you're done with that, you hit go and send it off to like server farms and sort of produce your footage. When you're like distributing the content, it's a little tricky, right? It can take forever to like sort of upload this content to various services. We're almost entering back into like the DVD phase, almost, it feels like. But for playback, I think that's where I don't think you'd ever send down the whole thing. You'd have to sort of use different representations. I don't think you're ever going to really fully get that full pixel saturation thing unless you do something like sort of similar to the pyramid thing I think Facebook talked about, where you want to like focus pixels in front of your face.
We don't use it anymore at all.
I know, but I like to talk about it. Yeah.
Cool. So what sort of levels of like H.264 and VP9 and that are you seeing phones able to actually decode today? And are you looking at any sort of field of view based adaptive streaming sort of delivery techniques to send like only the active area that you're looking at to devices rather than such a large frame?
So I think with a lot of the work that we've sort of focused on has been more at sort of like that end-to-end ecosystem phase, and that when you look at it, field of view type serving, that's kind of more of like a separate transport discussion. And at that point, right, let's say if you did upload it to a service, they are free to sort of transform the data in whatever way they want. And I kind of kept that part out of this talk because there's not a lot of standards emerging out of that space yet.
So you mentioned there's 3 different levels, 0, 1, and 2 of the layout. What about layouts that are sort of interleaved? Have you guys tried any of those, and why were they rejected?
We did tinker around with like a left-right alternating representation. Again, I think that's more of something that at least we were tinkering with on like the transport side. But on the editing side, right, when you like open this up in a Premiere or something, from like a creator perspective, like just having like both eyes there makes things a little easier.
Okay, this one. Sorry, Ken, I think he had his hand up first. Last one.
Yeah, I was wondering what Google's thinking about support for positional tracking, 6-degree of freedom stuff, moving past this.
Yeah, I think we're going to be stuck with 3DOF video for a while. That's kind of what I'm working on, so I hope so.
Cool. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, last call on the talk sheet.